Hey everybody, this is the second part of my milling and mashing tests. Today I'm going to do a series of 4 mashes based on different mill gap settings and just see what comes about from gravity and clarity, things like that. As you can see, I kind of varied the range from small to large gaps, slow to fast speeds, conditioned, unconditioned, also not stirring and stirring the mash. Here's a list of the ingredients I use for all 4 mashes. 2 of them are going to be a little bit darker as a lot more Munich was added from the homebrew supply shop, but that shouldn't make a difference. This first mash is going to be grain conditioned, so I'm just spraying the water on the grain to plump up the kernels. Going for a slow RPM, so once again I start my recorded speed on my phone and I just match the pitch. Conditioned grain really puts a lot of stress on the drill. It really has to chug through this. You can see it's pretty slow as well. Out of all the 4 mashes, this one had the least amount of dust or flour. Here's a little view of the crush. A lot of husk material. You can see a lot of intact husks, which is very good. Very beneficial when you're sparging, lautering. Here's a view of some leftover wort after the mash. You can see there's some sediment in there, but overall it's fairly clear. And here's the grain after the lauter. Okay, we're going to move on to our next test here. This is the same slow RPM, but we're going to increase the gap size to 0.042. And unconditioned with the grain. This wider gap's a little easier on the drill. It's not struggling as hard to get through the grain, even though it is still very slow. You can see since we didn't condition, there's a little bit more flour. Not as much as if you had a tighter mill gap, but it's still there. And here's the crush. You can see there's quite a bit of husk material, which is positive. You can see all those full kernels. Sometimes I think this gap might be a little too wide, as there's some kernels in there that just seem like they're not cracked open enough. And here we have the leftover wort from the mash. You can see it's very clear. Still some sediment at the bottom though. And here is the grain. Okay, now we're going to move on to our third mash, and this is going to be at the highest speed of my drill, which is pretty quick in comparison to the 46 RPM, and also a tighter mill gap. As you can see, the mill is just mowing through the grain here. It looks quite vicious in comparison. And with that speed comes a lot of flour. Quite a bit on there in comparison to the conditioned grain and even the 0.042 gap at the slow speed. And here's our crush. Quite a bit more flour, less husk material visible. And here's the leftover wort after the mash. As you can see, very clear. Still some sediment down there, but overall very clear. And here's the grain. For the fourth mash test, I decided to change the mill gap setting. I wanted to hit something in between 28 and 42, so I went with 37. This will once again be at the slowest RPM, which is 46. Definitely not as fast as 500 RPM. And there is some flour, as we would expect, if it's not conditioned. Here's our crush. You can see a fair amount of husk material. Looks good, but still some flour in there as well. I think that's a decent mix. I don't see any kernels that are left untouched. Alright, on this mash I decided to stir, as the gravity readings on the prior three were pretty low, and I realized that you just can't get away from stirring. So as I'm doughing in, I just decided to stir a little bit to distribute the grain, and then I'll continue with my underletting. We'll put the lid on and let that sit. As you can see from the first reading, the gravity is already up at least 2 points. And here's the wort after the mash. Nice and clear with the same amount of sediment. And here's the grain after the mash. Okay, I've put a comparison of all 4 mashes along with their associated milling techniques. And I think the first thing that jumps out at me is just how similar all of the mashes turned out. If I had to pick one attribute, I'd say the larger mill gaps seem like they're a little more clear. But gravity-wise, they're all very close. And that was a little bit of a surprise to me, as the homebrew world likes to mill very fine in terms of improving efficiency.